My friend ROSIE Llewellyn-Jones is an extremely distinguished Indian historian. She's written many books about the history of India. Google her and you'll see just how productive she has been and continues to be. I approached her to say that the festival was interested in having an event making the connections between this building and Hackney and the East India Company, which was not her specialised area of knowledge, but she's done a great deal of research just for this to tell us about Thomas Millward, Sutton House, the East India Company and other connections between Hackney and India. Please give her a round of applause.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
No.
There's no microphone, and there's also no remote control. So I'm going to sit there and do the slide.
Unfortunately, none of the microphones are working, so please project. I'm sorry.
There are two seats up the front there.
I moved it. Sorry, I think I knocked it.
So I am amazed at the amount of interest in Hackney, in its history. And I was just telling Laurie, who's actually a cousin as well as a friend, that we have nothing like this in Wandsworth. I wish we did. So, congratulations on the turnout and all the events going on. So, the East India Company in Hackney, you may not think that there are many connections at first. In fact, I didn't either, but as Laurie said, I did quite a lot of research, and I did find some interesting links. And in fact, when we're talking about the East India Company, we're talking about one of the major employers of people in this area, particularly Hackney, because of the docks and the East India Company House. So I'll start with a brief history of the East India Company. And this is the coat of arms. It's not the original coat of arms. This was remade in about 1720, and it says under the auspices of the King and the Parliament. The company itself was started in 1600, and it was a trading company. It grew to be one of the largest, in fact probably the largest, multinational company of the 18th and 19th century. It was abolished in 1858 after the Indian Mutiny. And it's interesting because the people in the company changed over 300 years from traders to rulers. So by 1858, the middle of the 19th century, they were in effect the governors of India. Not the whole of India, because there are quite a number of what they call native states, but a good proportion of India. And after the company was abolished in 1858, the government of Britain took over the ruling of the whole of the Indian subcontinent and remained as government until 1947. Now, it seems extraordinary to me that a small country like England, and we're just talking about England because it was the English East India Company, extraordinary that such a small country could rule over somewhere as large as the Indian subcontinent. And we're talking about undivided India, so we're talking about what now encompasses Pakistan, Bangladesh, and the whole continent of India. And as I said, when you think about it, it seems quite extraordinary that we were able to rule it for such a long time And when I was younger, I was able to talk to people who'd actually worked in the government of India, English people. And again, it seems to me extraordinary. Now, I've actually lived so long, I've spoken to people who were in India in the 1940s and sometimes even earlier. So that's, I think, is what I wanted to start off by saying. We're going to look at the influence of the East India Company, particularly in Hackney, but I've had to sort of embrace a lot of East London, so Stoke Newington and other places. And here is something which you might think slightly reminds you of Sutton House, where we are, certainly those Tudor windows. This was the first East India Company house. As I said, the company started in 1600. This is the earliest representation we've got of their Tudor house, and it was in Leadenhall Street. You might think that's not terribly near Hackney, but in fact, if you look at the A10, it actually goes straight down to the city. It's the old Ermine Road, the old Roman road. So it makes sense that people would settle in Hackney who had connections with the East India Company, and certainly some of the wealthy directors chose to live in Hackney. In fact, one of them in this very house, because it was convenient for the docks, it was convenient for the company headquarters in the city, and yet it was still in the country. You could afford to build something very large estate, a large garden. So it makes quite a lot of sense. There were a number of directors who lived in this area. And here we've got something which is quite unabashed trading. You can see that enormous ship, painted on plaster, apparently. It's a shame we don't have it in colour. At the top, a merchant seaman, a Tudor seaman, and the dolphins on both sides. So it's very clearly a trading company. It's using ships and trade and money. And you can see the coat of arms just underneath that ship. So there we are, 1661, just before the Tower of London. And this is what it turned into. So you can see how the company developed, became wealthy, rich, confident. And this was the house, again in Leadenhall Street, on the same site, in about 1800. It's very fine. It's now got all kinds of things. It's got a small museum, treasures, which people have brought back from India, inside it. And today, it's been replaced by Lloyd's building, you know, that enormous sort of modern building. In a way, I think that's quite appropriate. It's a trading site, and it continues to be with Lloyd's today. And this is what it looked like inside. This is the auction room. And obviously, the idea of trading, you bring back goods from India and also China, because it was a kind of three-way trade, and you auction them off here. What I can't make out is whether the goods are actually in the centre of the room. It's not clear enough to see, but certainly items are being auctioned and the profits go to the company and to the directors. There's something like 200 directors throughout the life of the East India Company, and we're going to look at one or two of them. So it's all very grand. It's full of statues of Romans, and in fact it is often said that the English saw themselves somewhat as the Romans did in Britain. The English saw themselves as successors to the Mughal government in India. So things are being auctioned, and we'll look in a minute at the kind of things that were on sale. And here we are, Sutton House, and this is where John, could you put the next one please? Sorry. That's right, these are the names. So John Millward of Sutton House, director in 1625, he came, we're not quite sure whether he was actually a sea captain as well as a director. There's some confusion, and I couldn't quite figure out what his role was. If he was a captain, then he made several voyages to India. It doesn't mean that he couldn't subsequently become a director. But one John Millwood, certainly of Sutton House, ran into debt, considerable debt. He was owing for 19 bales of raw silk, and silk was one of the principal imports from India, so he got into quite a lot of trouble with that. And the bales of silk, apparently, very precise measurements, 143 pounds, one bale. And the price was about £25 in those days, which is equivalent to about 4,000 today. So if one bale alone costs £4,000, equivalent to £4,000, you can see that if John Millwood can't pay for 19 bales, he's really in trouble. The other people, I couldn't find out very much about them, but we've got an image of Joseph Hurlock, who lived just a little further north. Anyway, this is the only portrait I could find of any of these people that we're talking about. I thought that was quite nice. It's a silhouette. Thank you. And so we're talking about ships. We're talking about a lot of ships. The first East India Company ship went out to Surat, which is on the west coast, in 1607. So it obviously took about 7 years for them to get organised, to get their ships going. And it obviously went round the Cape. And the reason it went to Surat was that this was one of the first sites where the English settled when they got trading privileges. And they couldn't just march in and start trading. They had to get permission from the Mughal emperors. And at this point, India was infinitely bigger and richer, more organised than England. So the traders were rather humble men going along begging for permission to start trading in a very minor way. And this is part of the fascination of how it started from such a small base. So that was the first ship. And a lot of these ships were actually made in India, in Bombay, by Indian shipbuilders. There was a family called the Wadia brothers, and they specialised in these ships. Very, very fine. And you can see the ensign at the bottom, which is Union Jack, the colours, surrounded by a mass of red. And just to give you an idea, this is a replica ship. I'm not sure when it was made, but I thought it was rather interesting to see it contrasted to Tower Bridge. Then you get some idea of the size of it. They were enormous. And of course, voyages took a very long time. 6 months was the average, but it could take much longer. When you've got sailing ships, you're obviously reliant on the trade winds, so you had to catch the wind at the right time. If you were very unlucky, you ended up in South America and had to wait for the wind the way back. And I think the smoke coming out is probably from cannons, because these are not steamships. Obviously, once you've got steamers, it's speeded everything up to some extent. So there you are, imagine sort of setting off from Deptford in one of those, and it's going to take you at least 6 months. But the profits were absolutely enormous when they could be made. If the ship didn't sink, if the cargo came back intact, there were huge profits to be made. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. The reason that they were trading, it was money. You had to invest a lot of money, obviously. John Millwood, as we've seen, was buying silk veils. He was investing a huge amount. In the end, he couldn't pay it, but a lot of money. This is the whole point of trading. So let's have a look at the silk trade. As I said, it was the most important import from India for a very long time. Raw silk from Bengal. It was Bengal in particular because there was something about the soil there and the water which made silk very, very productive. And I don't need to tell you probably, it's developed from cocoons, the little silk cocoons, and they feed on mulberry trees. The East India Company was very keen to promote the silk trade, and what they said was that they would actually allow people 2 years free land. They didn't have to pay rent for 2 years if they were prepared to plant mulberry trees. And there were all kinds of concessions. And in fact, the East India Company set up a number of silk factories, which are called filatures, which is where you get the cocoons, you have to put them into boiling water to start unwrapping them, and you know, they're quite sticky and gummy, and then you have to reel them, and for some reason, Piedmont in Italy had developed a new method of reeling silk. It's very, very fine fabric, as you can imagine, but if you can reel 2 threads at one time and twist them, it's actually much stronger. So this is what the company did. And they were investing considerable sums of money. You have to invest in order to reap a profit. So silk, as I say, was one of the main imports. And it was carried in bales, these famous bales that John Milford bought and then couldn't pay for, and processed in silk mills in Hackney. And I was very interested to find a picture of Silk Mill Lane in Hackney, near the river, which I'll show you in a minute. And it was a very important trade. It provided work, and once the Huguenots start to settle here, you've got a whole process going on here in East London. Murshidabad in Bengal was really the centre of the silk trade. Murshidabad was the old capital of Bengal. This was long before Calcutta took over. And it's a fascinating place, as you can see, very, very busy area, a wealthy area. And so this is where the majority of the silk came from. It was then shipped downriver to Calcutta, which was a very tiny little port at the time, and loaded onto the company's ships. The ships couldn't actually go up as far as Murshidabad because they were too large. So you can imagine some of these little barges, this is actually a pleasure barge, but you can imagine sort of little cargo ships coming down to Calcutta, where they're then loaded onto those big company ships, and they set out again for England. That's another 6 months. And one thing you have to be careful about with silk is that it doesn't get damp. And one of John Milward's pleas, when he was charged with being a debtor for such a large amount of money, was to say that some of the bales had got damp, and that ruined the silk. Well, that was his excuse anyway. So this is where it came from, this is where it started. And here we are, more silk skeins. The skeins were put into the bales. I'm not sure how many skeins you get in one bale. But what's interesting, I thought, was these are different colours. And it depends on the kind of silk cocoon, the silk worm, and also what they're actually fed on. Mulberry tree is the best, but it has to be a specific kind of mulberry tree. If it's the wrong sort, if it's an Indian mulberry, it produces a paler kind of silk. Sorry, this is all rather technical, but it fascinated me. Thank you. And here's a silk weaver. This is not a Huguenot, it's probably someone early 19th century, but it gives you an idea of the complexity of the looms. And it's interesting that people are still weaving like this in Bengal, particularly in Calcutta. I saw some weavers just over a year ago, and it was very, very similar with the shuttle going in like that. Probably this weaver can push himself back and forward, I think, on the runners there. But this is the kind of thing you would have seen, certainly in East London, if not necessarily in Hackney. So the company ships started in Deptford, and here they are, again with some of their ensigns. And they provided a huge amount of work for people. You can imagine not only the seamen themselves, but the labourers, the people who needed to unload all the goods, and in fact to load up with other things. And you might ask, well, what did the East India Company actually take to India because trade goes both ways. And for a long time, they took what is called broadcloth, which is a fairly thick woolen material. And you think, well, for goodness sake, taking wool to India. In fact, parts of India are cold, but it also provided uniforms for the growing East India Company's armies. And silver bullion too. They had to take something so they could actually buy goods when they got there. So there was a lot of silver bullion going out in exchange for the silk and the other goods. And here we are unloading the ships. Again, this is probably early 19th century. I couldn't find an earlier image, but it gives you some idea of the sort of bustle and, you know, the vastness of the enterprise and how many people would have been involved. You would have had clerks checking everything. You needed warehouses, you needed warehouse keepers. You need to keep what you've brought in free from animals and from theft, so you need guards and all kinds of things. So you can see the some of the boxes being stacked up at the back. It was an immense amount of work, and it provided an immense amount of opportunities for people here. I wouldn't say it was as big as the mining industry, but it was considerable. And this is a slightly grimmer picture. This is one of the big warehouses. You can imagine all along the docks, all along the East India Dock Road. I mean, there's virtually nothing left today, but you can imagine what these warehouses were like. And goods are coming in and they're marked WD, VR down there, so they know who they're destined for. Pulling them in, pushing them out, that kind of thing. A huge amount of labour and hard labour too. All kinds of people were employed. People who were out of work would go along for a short time. And interestingly enough, a volunteer, I wouldn't call it an army, but volunteer soldiers were formed from some of the labourers who were prepared for a Napoleonic invasion. And whether they wore uniforms, I don't know, but I thought it was quite interesting that out of this huge amount of labourers, you've actually got enough to create a very small regiment, or at least a military unit. Next. So these are some of the warehouses and the goods, and I'll just read it out quickly for those who may not be able to see. So by 1800, the company occupied major warehouses to the north of Thames, in New Street, Crutch Friars, Hayden Square, Fenchurch Street, Drury Street, French Ordinary Court, Billiter Lane, Seething Lane, Leadenhall Street, of course, where the headquarters were, Cooper's Road, St Helens, Ratcliffe, and Bottlefoy. None of these names make much sense to me because I'm not in East London. Sure they will to you. So the range of goods that were being brought from Asia, mainly from India, but some from China. Tea, of course, this came later on. This was sort of mid-19th century. Coffee. Spices were one of the earliest things that the company went for, though it was silk, which was always the main export at this point. Drugs, that would be stuff like camphor, Indian hemp, flax, sugar, indigo, that became very, very popular until aniline dyes were invented at the beginning of the 20th century. Indigo was the one thing you needed to produce that lovely blue colour. Saltpetre, which was used in gunpowder. We don't really have saltpetre in England. It's very specific, so there wasn't enough. And in fact, the British government asked for a certain proportion of saltpetre from the company in order to create gunpowder. So that was actually more important than it seems. Muslins, calicos, silks, shawls, Chinese textiles, because as I said, it was a three-way trade, woolens and metals. So that gives you an idea of what goes into those ships and into all those bales and what are unloaded. Calcutta a mental asylum. You may think this is a bit of a jump in subject, but in fact it isn't, because you had a large number of Britons working in the East India Company, working in India. They were working as clerks. Some of them were officers, and they were ordering around Indian soldiers, but a lot of clerks, warehouses, and then you get people who were negotiating to buy all these goods. So it was a fair proportion of Britons who were in India. The death rate was terribly high. I know it was high, obviously, for Indians. We simply don't have that amount of information, but we do have a lot of information about the very high death rate among Britons. The average life expectancy for a young English clerk going out to India was 30 years. If they managed to survive beyond that, they've done very well indeed. And interestingly enough, too, when we start to look at some of the burial records, we find that there's quite a number of British women there too. We don't often associate women with the East India Company unless they were the wives of prominent officers. But there were a fair number of women who had gone out too, not always to get married either, some as missionaries. And unfortunately, there's a very high rate of mental illness there. You could imagine that the heat had something to do with it. The loneliness, the homesickness were factors too. These are very powerful emotions that are not often talked about. And a fair proportion of people did actually lose their minds. And the company were not insensitive to this. Obviously, they had hospitals for physical illnesses, but they're also worried about sort of mental inabilities, and particularly among the soldiers and the officers. And we find one of the earliest mental establishments is way back about 1750, and it's in one of the army camps. So you can see it's a problem there already. And now we're looking at civilian problems. And this mental hospital was set up in 1831, and it's at Llewellyn-Jones, which is south of Calcutta. And you can see it's an open, airy place. And, you know, very much like the Victorians, it was thought that fresh air, greenery, gardens, that kind of thing would help. And I think in some cases it certainly did. But it's not a particularly good look for the East India Company, who by this point are practically ruling parts of India, to have mad people on your staff. So what they did was to send them back home to England. And Pembroke House, I don't actually have a picture of the house itself, but it was near Mare Street. Next, please. And what they did was to position to insane persons returning from India under the patronage of the Honourable East India Company. And the company were, as I said, not insensitive to their staff who needed looking after. And so they were prepared to pay Dr. George Rees. He himself lives in Finsbury Square, not in Hackney. But he charged £100 a year for officers and £50 a year for men, that is, who weren't officers or men. You see the difference. It was very, very hierarchical. So Pembroke House, there is some information about it in the Office archives of the British Library. I didn't have time to go into it, but it would be quite interesting to look at some of the people who were shipped back from India. And some of them included women too, and occasionally maids to East India Company officers, which I thought was interesting. Thank you. Ayahs. Now, ayah is a particular word, an Indian word, which means a nursemaid, not always dealing with children, but mainly dealing with children. And some of these ayahs were actually brought back by East India Company staff officers to England. We think that this particular ayah, she's the dark woman there with her hand on the child's dress. We think her name was Clorinda, and we think she was the ayah or nursemaid for the Clive family, not Robert Clive, but related to him. And this painting is by Sir Joshua Reynolds. But what really struck me when I was looking at it, if you look at the English people, they're very pallid, and they're very stiff. And in fact, the woman, the mother, is actually holding the chin of the child. So there's a lot of stiffness associated with it. But you can see how the artist was entranced by Clorinda, the ayah. I mean, she's very, very vivid. She stands out, the most vivid portrait in this picture, and I thought that was interesting. He was obviously quite entranced by her beautiful hair, her lovely skin. So she's an ayah who actually came to England. And this is one who didn't. This is the Butterworth family. They're in 19th century Kanpur, which is now in Uttar Pradesh. But I put it in because it shows how the ayah is sort of part of the family, and yet not part of the family. They were usually Hindus. Occasionally, they were Christians who'd been converted. But it's an interesting role, as I say, part and yet not part of the family. Obviously, you needed someone to look after your children. This was not something that English women would do. They wouldn't look after their own children. They would get an ayah or a nursemaid to do it. And here we are, the first ayah's home. Now, you can see that if you're actually bringing ayahs home, nursemaids home with you, what are you going to do with them? Are you going to keep on employing them like Clorinda was employed, or do you just want them on the voyage and then you finished with them? So what do you do with them? The idea was that the ayahs who actually brought here would then try and get a journey back, a voyage back to India, looking after another family who were going out to India by ship and obviously wanted a nursemaid for the particular voyage. So you have an exchange. This is something that obviously needs a lot more work doing, but there's certainly an exchange mechanism. There's a group of people who are sorting out ayahs coming. Do you want a nursemaid on your journey to India? That kind of thing. And so we've got the first ayah's home, the London City Mission. I think this was in Hackney, but I'm not entirely sure. You can see that there's going to be a problem if the ayahs can't actually get a journey back to India. What are you going to do with them? They've been paid off. They're not exactly destitute, but you certainly don't want a lot of fairly well-educated Indian women wandering around without any means of support. So the ayah's home is open.
I'm trying to think whether that is the ayah's home in King Edward's Road or not. Is that
No, it's not. No, I wasn't aware of that after. So this is the first ayah's home, but we think that one was set up as early as about 1812 by a missionary society, and there's quite a strong missionary element with the ayahs too. As I say, some of them were Christians, not all of them, but the missionary societies certainly took on the problem of these Indian women who were sometimes left quite bereft in a foreign country. This is the one in King Edward Road, which was refurbished, and we went to the reopening, I think it was a couple of years ago, when Mira Sayal came along. This is what it looked like. It's quite, quite clear. It's the ayah's home now. All that lettering is gone, and you wouldn't really know now, apart from the blue pack, that this is where it was. And it made sense too. It made sense that it was in Hackney, because then they're near the docks. So if they do get a passage back, they don't have to traipse all across London or across the whole country. Next, please. And here they are. It's a photograph of them actually in the King Edward home. And you can see that the woman on the right-hand side has Chinese features. As I said, you know, they were both Chinese ayahs, they were called ayahs, and the Indians one too. And they're sitting round probably being preached at, or at least doing something. Next, please. And I'm not sure what this was. It's some kind of procession. I think you can see their little English children on the walls behind. So they're watching something, and the ayahs have been brought out onto the pavement to look at something. Now, the Madras method of teaching, you might wonder what this has relevance to Hackney, but in fact, this was a method by which the older pupils would teach the younger ones, and it was particularly prevalent in South India, and it was introduced to England by Joseph Lancaster, who subsequently set up the borough school near the Elephant and Castle. And it looks rather forbidding, and rows of pupils. And as I said, the idea was you get one of the older boys to instruct the younger ones. Because it came from South India, it was known as the Madras method of teaching, and there was a Madras house in Mare Street. We don't know where, but this is how they were taught. And Captain Brenton himself set up the school at Hackney Wick. Not really that many connections with India, but he was taking poor children, destitute in some cases, and educating them to go out and work in the colonies, but not India. So mainly Australia and South Africa. And his school was actually in Silk Mill Lane, which is the concluding slide. There we are. It's just down from Castle Road, apparently. Obviously, there's nothing left here, but I thought that rather nicely tied in to the first part of our talk about silk in Hackney. So I hope you
That's the Hackney Brook. I think it's the bottom of Kenworthy Road, if you know the area.
Is it?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Well, good. Thank you very much.
10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, don't ask me anything about I'm from Wandsworth, but I'm from Hackney here.
You want to pick it or do you want me to do it? This is a nice band form. You can start off with it.
Okay. I'm rather deaf, so you have to speak up.
Did the many scandals associated with the East India Company contribute to the abolition as well as the Indian Mutiny?
Sorry, I missed the first one.
There's several
yeah.
several corruption scandals were
Yes.
associated with the Indian Mutiny. Did they contribute to the abolition of the company as well as the Indian Mutiny?
It wasn't exactly corruption. That had been more or less stamped up by the beginning of the 19th century. There were very, very, severe restrictions put in. In the 18th century, you're absolutely right, it was totally corrupt. People made huge fortunes, and when they came back to England, they were called nabobs, which is a kind of, a pun on the nabobs, the rulers. No, I think the thing with the mutiny is that the East India Company really didn't know what was going on. That they also started to let in Christian missionaries, and this didn't help because the soldiers, the sepoys, the Indian soldiers, were afraid that somehow they were going to be turned into Christians. They didn't quite know how, but that was one of their main fears. And also that the company was absolutely ruthless in taking over parts of India. There was something called the doctrine of lapse, which meant that if there was no direct heir to the province, then the company could move in and take it over and create a huge resentment. So not so much corruption as really insensitive moves.
Do you want me to pick the questions?
I want you to repeat the questions to me.
All right, at the back, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask, whether you had any biographical details of the ayahs and ayahs, whether one had accounts of their biographies and their perceptions of their time in London.
Do we have any? Did you hear the question?
Yes, we don't. This is why I think more work needs to be done. We don't even know their names. Somewhere there must have been registers kept of, the ayahs in the home, the sort of coming and going, when they had room for a new one, when someone left. But so far we haven't explored that.
I would say I believe the Hackney Museum are doing some research about this at the moment. I don't know if there's anyone from the museum here.
There is a whole project going on. And the people who worked on the women from Hackney History also dug up quite a lot of information about the
Can't hear.
I think this is work in progress. I mean, since the blue pad was unveiled, there's been a lot of interest in trying to find out more about the ayahs and looking at records of local churches and so forth.
Yeah, and
And
so
this is
hopefully
something
there
that
will be a talk about that next year.
What you were saying about the mental asylums, both in Calcutta and the UK, was fascinating. I had a couple of questions. Was your primary source the East India Archive at the British Library? And also, do you know if anyone has written around that subject?
So,
What was the source of your information about the mental asylums in India? Archival source.
Yes, it was mainly from the British Library because I wrote a book which was published a few years ago called Empire Building, but I was looking really at the construction of British India, and one of the things which fascinated me was the hospitals. So I started off with the hospitals for physical problems, and then got interested in the mental asylums too. But again, something that there is one book which was published quite a few years ago called Mad Tales from the Raj by Ernst Waltraud, that's Waltraud, and that gives quite a good background. But, Pembroke House, I couldn't resist the connection.
Should we say, is it correct that the term Delali comes from one of the sanatoriums?
Yeah.
The term Delali?
I didn't hear that.
The term Delali comes from one of the sanatoriums in the town of...
Dulali.
Dulali is a garage.
Oh, she's good. Yes, it is actually. That was a specific place near Bombay, and it was where the British soldiers were stationed before they came back to England. And because they often had to wait for such a long time, it was said they'd gone to Lally. Probably politically incorrect to say that today, but yes.
These ayahs as hospitals where they live. How long did they carry on? I mean, were the ayahs employment when they stayed there? Was that still going in the 20th century?
Yes, as far as I know, it was. I mean, I've certainly talked to elderly people who were serving in India before 47. Most of them died now. But when I interviewed them, yes, I mean, they would talk fondly about their ayahs. They didn't necessarily all bring them back.
But how long did the ayah homes, how long did they exist for? Was it going in the 20th century?
Well, as far as I can tell, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say my father was born and brought up in Calcutta, and he had an ayah whom he was very fond.
Yes.
And she had to stay, but they left after partition, and she had to stay in India. She was very upset about that, and I think that's true of a lot of ayahs.
Yes.
They weren't allowed to come to England for one reason or another.
Yes, I think they probably weren't. The British were very severe about that in 1947. And in fact, there were a lot of Anglo-Indians who I think by rights should have been allowed to come to Britain. And the British government put every kind of obstacle in their path. But one of the interesting things about ayahs and talking, to people who had them, that they would teach their little English children Hindi nursery rhymes. So, the children would perhaps remember that when they didn't remember anything else about India.
My great aunt and my granny were raised by ayahs, and they actually learned Burmese as their first language because they were so close to their ayahs, and also their parents didn't want them to let the ayahs to speak to them in English because they didn't want them to get a Burmese accent in
Yes,
English.
that's right. I mean, you've only got to think of people like Rudyard Kipling, the sort of sense of homesickness when he actually left India, he was a young child, speaking Hindi, feeling alienated from everything in England, not surprisingly.
Anybody remember what you said a minute ago? Let them go around the mulberry bush on a bright and frosty morning. That surely comes from the mulberry bush.
Here we go around the mulberry.
Yes.
Is that
It's something
connected with the silk trade?
70 years ago.
I suppose it could be. I hadn't thought of that. I can't say one way or the
Well,
other.
maybe on that one. So, yeah.
Partly publicity. Women from Hackney's History 1 has a story of a woman called Minnie Green, who was an ayah, and we got most of her story from a court case, because she actually sued her employer. So you can dig this part up, but as people were saying, there is a project at Hackney Museum, I think Nitty, I've forgotten her surname, but anyway, heads up Hackney Museum, she's very involved in it. It's a whole project digging out history of ayahs.
I'm delighted to hear it.
Partly based in Australia. I don't know whether there must have been a move that way. But yeah, the ayah's home closed in 1921, and I think that was basically in Hackney, but the first ones were in Aldgate. There were 2 in Aldgate. But basically run by the same people.
Yes, yeah, that's fascinating.
Last one, thank you.
Me?
Yes.
Thank you. Returning to the insane returnees, do you happen to know whether there was any Quaker involvement when they got back to this country? Because I have a half memory of hearing that the Quakers in York, who opened the retreat, round about that time, had some involvement.
In York, you say?
In York. There was an asylum called the Retreat, which alas is now flat, surprise, surprise. But it was a very enlightened mental asylum for about 200 years. My grandfather died in it, so I have vivid memories of it in the 1960s.
That's fascinating.
I will see what I can discover because it's very much whetted my appetite. The Quakers, of course, were much more enlightened about mental illness than I thought than most other people at that time. But hearing that the East India Company shared their levels of enlightenment is very interesting indeed.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. There's a 10-minute turnaround to the next talk, but I know Rosie did a great deal of work especially for this, and please give her a round of applause.